Red sky over the Middle East. The light of dawn over the Mediterranean Sea had not yet chased away the night when the sky above Israel erupted in a bloody red. Within the first 5 minutes of the operation, 9 key targets were hit, from the headquarters of the 89th Intelligence Division to backup energy hubs near Ashkelon. The operation, which Iranian sources called Retribution for Hermes, was not a surprise. It was silent, precise, and, most importantly, public. In Tehran, even before the first wave of strikes had concluded, a live broadcast began. State television channels showed footage of missile flights, pseudo-holograms of impacts over Tel Aviv, and, crucially, statements from IRGC commanders. "We are not at war with the people of Israel. We are at war with those who control them from abroad." This was a signal that was not just military, but diplomatic. The Israeli response was unexpectedly restrained. The IDF spokesperson's office reported minor damage to infrastructure and localized incidents. However, commercial satellite images showed the opposite: burning hangars, smoldering fields at Ben Gurion Airport, and a loss of radio signals on certain military frequencies. This wasn't an attack in the conventional sense. It was a demonstration that the shield could be pierced. Against this backdrop, the world's attention was fixed not on Tel Aviv, but on the UN, NATO, and, paradoxically, Amman, where an unofficial meeting between an Iranian delegation and representatives of Arab states had taken place the day before the strikes. No statements followed, but the diplomatic tone was set. Some Arab countries knew or suspected what was coming. Meanwhile, social media was flooded with drone footage, crimson smoke over Haifa, hundreds of people running into the Ashdod metro, and, most alarmingly, unknown aircraft over the southern Negev desert, unidentified by air defense systems. Specialists from Bellingcat later stated these were likely drones with infrared cloaking elements, a technology previously seen in the arsenal of Yemen's Houthis. What particularly stunned the international press was the silence of Israel's allies. Neither the United States, the United Kingdom, nor France made a single official statement in the first few hours. Bloomberg and Foreign Policy noted this fact as a deliberate waiting game. Even steadfast allies like the Czech Republic and Australia limited themselves to phrases about the need for de-escalation, without directly condemning Tehran. At the same time, information previously dismissed as conspiracy theory began to surface. According to an investigation by Middle East Eye, Jordanian airspace was temporarily accessible at the moment the Iranian missiles passed through, and not a single one of the country's air defense systems was activated. The same was true for the airspace over Iraq. Experts suggest this was prearranged, if not explicitly, then by default. A silent consent as a way of expressing discontent. On the streets of Jerusalem, people whispered, "Where is America? Why is France silent? How many allies will be left if things get worse tomorrow?" For the first time in many years, Israel's international support seemed not like a guarantee, but an illusion that shatters with every strike and every hour of silence from Washington. Jordan. Guardian or traitor? When Iranian missiles crossed the skies over Iraq and entered Jordanian airspace, the radars were silent. Not a single intercept, not a single volley from the air defense batteries that, by agreement with the West, were stationed in the kingdom. This fact caused bewilderment, first in Jerusalem, then in London, and later in the Pentagon. Jordan is an ally of Israel under the 1994 peace treaty, a partner of the U.S. in its defense program, and formerly part of the anti-terror coalition. But on that night, it simply closed its eyes. The publication Axios reported that Jordan had activated regime neutrality, a protocol under which the country does not interfere with the transit of interregional munitions if they do not pose a direct threat to its sovereignty. This terminology appeared in think tank reports back in 2022, but only now was it put into action. In essence, Jordan chose not to become a target by allowing the missiles to fly through. Israel's reaction was swift. A spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spoke of an unacceptable sabotage of Allied obligations. However, Amman gave no grounds for conflict. The royal court issued a statement calling for de-escalation from all sides, avoiding any direct accusations. Meanwhile, the Times of Israel and Haaretz began publishing the opinions of military experts, some of whom suggested that Jordan may not have just closed its eyes, but had coordinated a safe flight corridor. One source reported, they knew where the rockets were going, and they knew they weren't for them. This caused a quiet diplomatic storm, but in Washington, no one chose to escalate. The State Department limited itself to the phrase, Every country has the right to its own defense strategy. Jordan found itself in a strange position. On one hand, it is a friend of the West and a recipient of billions in aid from the US and EU. On the other, it is a state surrounded by unstable regimes and facing internal protests. Over the last 2 years, the level of discontent in Amman has been growing. Prices, unemployment, Syrian refugees, and pressure from religious groups have all made the country especially sensitive to any external risk. According to a poll by Al Arabi Al Jadid magazine, over 67% of Jordan's population opposed any military intervention, even indirect, in defense of Israel. This explains a lot. The political elite simply reflected the mood of the streets. And when the people and the government coincide in their passivity, it's no longer a coincidence, but a trend. In the wake of this incident, Israeli society began talking about a new map of loyalty in the Middle East. If even neighbors with whom peace treaties have been signed are not willing to offer open support, then who is left? Saudi Arabia is silent. Egypt limits itself to statements. Jordan retreats into the shadows. This is not just a geopolitical crisis. It is the dismantling of old alliances. Meanwhile, according to Debkafil, U.S. military bases in Jordan continue to operate normally, but the level of interaction between the two armies has decreased. Israeli planes, which once freely crossed Jordanian airspace, now receive clearance with a delay. It's a technical measure, but behind it lies a diplomatic signal. Jordan is not an enemy, but it is also not the ally it was thought to be. At a critical moment, it chose the path of silence. And in the new regional reality, that silence is louder than any speech at the UN Security Council. America, silent but participating. Amid the massive Iranian attack and the obvious passivity of regional allies, all eyes once again turned to Washington. Where was the White House? Where was the State Department? Where were the words of support, so familiar in any Middle East crisis? But America was silent, and this silence was strategic. The first statement from the White House came 17 hours after the attack began. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre stated, "The U.S. is closely monitoring the developing situation and supports Israel's right to self-defense. No condemnation of Iran, no mention of treaty obligations, just a vague phrase, like a diplomatic screen behind which much more was happening." According to the Wall Street Journal, on the night of the attack, American KC-135 tankers took off from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and headed towards southern Israel. Their mission, to refuel fighter jets patrolling the airspace. This means the U.S. provided technical support without even mentioning it publicly. But why did the White House choose a tactic of covert assistance? According to analysts at the Brookings Institution, the Biden administration fears being drawn into a direct conflict in an election year. Any open act of military aid could be used by opponents both at home and abroad, especially in the context of promises to focus on Asia and reduce the military presence in the Middle East. Nevertheless, the American presence is felt. Satellite images recorded increased activity at the base in the Negev, where a joint U.S.-Israel Arrow missile defense system is deployed. The Pentagon confirmed the movement of an RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft from Cyprus toward the Lebanese coast. And in the Red Sea, the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was spotted, deployed to deter threats from the south. However, all of this is happening in the format of quiet support. There are no loud statements, no promises, no demonstrative gestures. Israel is receiving help, but is left officially to face the threat alone. This is causing a wave of discontent in Tel Aviv. The newspaper Ma'arif published an article with the headline, "The U.S. Helps but Doesn't Save," featuring anonymous quotes from military officials and politicians disappointed in the new, cautious America. One of them admitted, "We were waiting for a strike on Tehran. We got help with our warehouses." The context of the U.S. election campaign is also interesting. Donald Trump, unlike Biden, did not remain silent. He declared, "This would not have happened under my watch," but offered no strategy. His supporters demand tough measures, but reject a new war for Israel. Even within the Republican Party, a split has emerged between pro-Israel hawks and isolationists who want to leave the Middle East. Against this backdrop, Israel finds itself in a disturbing reality. America seems to be nearby, but not fully present. It helps, but doesn't engage. It listens, but doesn't speak. And for a country that for centuries relied on a strategic patron, this is tantamount to geopolitical isolation. The Pentagon, of course, isn't leaving, but it isn't getting closer. The State Department speaks but doesn't promise. and the White House is silent. And today, that silence is louder than all the artillery on the border with Gaza, the British and German shadow war. While the U.S. refrains from direct intervention, other players are quietly stepping onto the stage, the United Kingdom and Germany. Not with loud press conferences or televised promises, but with actions that, like a mosaic, form a picture of covert participation in the conflict. Let's start with London. On June 24th, the Royal Air Force scrambled 2 Sentinel surveillance aircraft from its base in Akrotiri, Cyprus. Their route took them over the eastern Mediterranean, where they tracked drone activity in southern Israel and the West Bank. Despite the Ministry of Defense's claim of a routine patrol, the fact that data was being collected in a conflict zone did not go unnoticed. Sky News journalists assert that the British military has been using Cyprus as a logistical platform to support Israeli intelligence since 2021. However, this is the first time that data has been transferred in near real time. This may indicate that London, while not openly entering the conflict, is providing its ally with critically important information about aerial threats. The appearance of British warships in the Red Sea caused particular concern. The frigate HMS Richmond reportedly took up a position off the coast of Eilat, ostensibly to protect international shipping. But with the growing threat from the Houthis and long-range Iranian drones, experts believe the ship could be performing other tasks, from interception to electronic jamming. Turning to Germany, on June 25th, German authorities were forced to admit that over a 48-hour period, several Luftwaffe aircraft had made flights across the eastern Mediterranean, refueling in Greece. What exactly was being transported was not disclosed. However, sources at Der Spiegel claim it involved dual-use humanitarian and logistical supplies, including secure communication systems, anti-drone complexes, and portable radar systems. Against this backdrop, a leaked recording of German officers allegedly discussing the possibility of using NATO bases to transfer equipment to Israel in the event of a total defense collapse appeared online. Despite Berlin's denial, the German press speaks of unprecedented coordination between EU military structures and Israeli special services. Meanwhile, German society is showing its unwillingness to participate. According to ZDF, over 68% of those polled oppose Germany's military involvement in the Middle East conflict. Nevertheless, Chancellor Scholz calls Israel a state to whose defense Germany is historically obligated. This formula is increasingly sounding like a justification for actions that are not formally acknowledged. Analysts note that the participation of the UK and Germany is not a strategic pivot, but a forced step. The U.S. has taken a wait-and-see approach, France is wavering, and Arab allies are silent. In this vacuum, London and Berlin are becoming the second echelon of support. Unofficial, but tangible. Israel, for its part, welcomes any assistance but recognizes that help is coming not through open channels but through shadow paths, and that means that at any moment it could be cut off or replaced with diplomatic maneuvers, as has happened many times in the past. Thus, a new phenomenon arises, allies acting not as guarantors but as insurers. They aren't fighting the war. They are just trying to ensure Israel doesn't fall too quickly. But the question remains, if the war becomes large-scale tomorrow, who will be there? Not on radar, but on the battlefield. Macron's hypocrisy and the Arab dilemma. Amid the escalating crisis, public attention has shifted to Paris, a capital that has traditionally tried to play the role of a bridge between East and West. Speaking on June 26th at a briefing in the Élysée Palace, French President Emmanuel Macron declared, "France calls for an immediate de-escalation. Neither side should allow the conflict to spread to the entire region." It sounds convincing, but behind this facade lies a completely different game. According to Le Monde, 2 days before the Iranian strikes began, French intelligence received a warning from NATO partners about possible attacks on Israeli targets. However, instead of activating a coordination headquarters, Paris chose a wait-and-see position. There were no efforts to prevent escalation, no clear diplomatic line, only standard statements and diplomatic distance. Meanwhile, Tel Aviv is observing something else. French companies, including Thales, continue to supply Israel with components for radar systems. Despite official neutrality, the trade in military technology has not stopped. This has sparked anger in the Arab world. In Algeria, Tunisia, and Lebanon, demonstrations were held with slogans against hypocritical Paris. In Cairo, sermons in mosques mentioned the double standards of French policy. Macron himself is in a difficult position. On one hand, he faces domestic protests against rising prices and tensions ahead of snap elections. On the other, he has obligations to the EU and pressure from the Israeli lobby. According to a France 24 commentator, the president is trying to sit on two chairs, condemning the war publicly while continuing cooperation privately. In parallel, the Persian Gulf countries have also taken an ambiguous position. Saudi Arabia called for a ceasefire but did not condemn Iran's actions. Qatar increased aid to the Gaza Strip while simultaneously maintaining channels of communication with the U.S. The United Arab Emirates stopped supplying electronics to Israel but did not formally sever diplomatic relations. Experts believe the region is experiencing an Arab dilemma. On one hand, there is animosity towards Israel and sympathy for the Palestinians. On the other, there is a fear of destabilization and a war that could collapse the entire Middle Eastern economy. Even a simple blockade of the Strait of Hormuz would raise oil prices to levels comparable to the 1973 crisis. Iran, exploiting this indecision, continues to increase its influence. Through diplomatic channels in Oman and Iraq, it is offering a conditional truce, citing its right to protect holy sites. According to Al Arabiya, these proposals are perceived by Arab monarchies as blackmail, but a direct response has not yet followed. Meanwhile, a schism is growing on social media. Some accuse Arab leaders of cowardice, others of betrayal. Telegram channels in Bahrain and Kuwait are filled with calls for an open boycott of countries supporting Israel. Even at the UN, voices are being raised. The world cannot stand aside when civilizations are collapsing before our eyes. France and the Arab world have essentially found themselves in the same position, caught between word and deed. But in geopolitics, that is the most dangerous place to be. Because at the moment when decisiveness is needed, silence becomes a form of complicity. In both Tel Aviv and Tehran, they understand this and are placing their bets. The ghost of World War and the two blocs. As the smoke over Tel Aviv began to clear, it became obvious. This is not just another episode in the Middle East conflict. This is a turning point. The world is slowly but surely moving towards a new format of confrontation, a format in which there is no more room for neutrality, a format in which two camps are re-emerging, as in the Cold War. On one side, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, and their NATO allies. On the other, Iran, Russia, China, the Houthis, and proxy structures in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Between them lies a region trembling with fear, where each country tries to balance between gas contracts, military obligations, and street rage. The economic consequences are already being felt. Brent crude has exceeded $97 a barrel. Bloomberg reports that if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for even 3 days, oil prices could exceed $130. This would trigger a cascading crisis throughout the Eurozone and hit Asia, especially India and China. China, by the way, is keeping its distance for now, but has already increased its presence in Pakistan and its naval activity in the Arabian Sea. Within NATO, a regrouping is underway. Poland and the Baltic states are demanding a transfer of some forces from the southern flank to Eastern Europe. Turkey, despite its membership in the alliance, has refused to participate in any operations concerning Israel. Hungary and Slovakia are silent. The solidarity upon which NATO's structure was built is cracking under the pressure of Middle Eastern dynamics. Against this backdrop, Israel is no longer a regional player, but the central point of a new strategic axis. Its vulnerability has become a marker for everyone. If a powerful, technologically advanced state backed by the West can be attacked with precision right down to its command centers, then no one is invulnerable anymore. Russia, currently focused on Ukraine, is closely watching developments. Analysts at IRNA write that Moscow could use the conflict as an argument against the West at the UN and in bilateral negotiations with Iran. Moreover, there is a possibility of strengthening military-technical cooperation between Tehran and Moscow amid the isolation of both countries. The U.S. Corps, in turn, is preparing for the worst-case scenario. The Pentagon is developing plans for the evacuation of citizens from the Middle East, and collection points in Kuwait and Jordan are being activated. The NATO press service confirms that the alert level at bases has been raised to red. This does not mean imminent escalation, but indicates its probability. But most alarming is that no one can predict the next step. Not because it is unclear, but because there are too many players and too few deterrents. Any mistake, any incident, and the world could find itself on the brink of a conflict that would overshadow all previous ones. At the diplomatic level, consultations are beginning. France is proposing a Geneva format with the participation of Iran, the U.S., and Saudi Arabia. China is offering mediation. The UN is convening an emergency meeting. But time is not on the side of the diplomats. War works faster. Thus, a new geopolitical reality is being created with Israel at its core, ablaze, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by allies, but not broken. And if this reality leads to a world war, then it was here that it began. Conclusion: 6 days, 6 fracture lines. Iran has shown that it can strike with precision and noise. Israel has shown that it can be vulnerable. The United States has shown that it is not ready for an open confrontation. Europe has shown that it is afraid. The Arab world has shown that it is divided between conscience and fear. This is not just a Middle Eastern crisis. This is the beginning of a geopolitical reformatting, a return to blocs, ideologies, and spheres of influence, a return where even neutrality has become a luxury. And all this against a backdrop of weapons, oil, and an information war where truth and propaganda are intertwined beyond recognition. If the conflict dies down, the world will breathe a sigh of relief. But if it flares up, history will have a new starting point. And when the textbooks write, it all began with a strike on Haifa.